Hey everybody, this is Rex Bear with Leap Project, and tonight we're going to be discussing the NDE phenomenon, near-death experiences, with Dr. Penny Sartori. Penny is an expert in near-death experiences and worked as a nurse in a British hospital for 21 years, 17 of those being in intensive care. She is highly experienced and skilled in her role as an intensive care staff nurse and has conducted unique and extensive research into the near-death experiences of her patients. In 2005, she was awarded a PhD for her research into NDEs, and Dr. Sartori's work has received worldwide attention as well as media coverage. She has spoken at many conferences, both nationally and internationally, and her work has received the attention of HRH Prince Charles. So if you'd like to know more about Penny and the near-death experience phenomenon, check out drpennysartori.com. That's Penny with a Y, Sartori.com. Her book is available on Amazon. It's called The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences. It's a treasure trove of information as well as first-hand experiences of people that have had some amazing NDEs and what they brought back with them. So this is going to be an awesome hour of information. We've indicated a little bit previously, and I had the opportunity to get into your book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, and wow, I mean, it is absolutely incredible. You've got a great website, drpennysartori.com, a lot of information on there from the near-death experience phenomenon, and it's just really great to have you on the show. I was hoping if you would, for our listeners, describe a little bit about yourself, and then I'd like to jump into why you got into the NDEs.
Okay, well, I used to work as a nurse, as you've just said, and then I kind of thought I could do more really from outside, being outside, because I wanted to change things within nursing, and I decided to leave nursing and teach about near-death experiences, and I spent some time writing that book, and now I work at the university in Swansea, and I do teach two modules. One of them is called Exploring the Mind and Consciousness, and the other one is called Science, Spirituality and Health. And I teach that on the part-time humanities degree. The reason I got into near-death experiences is just through my job. You know, I began working in the ICU and I realised that people of all ages die. It's not just elderly people. You know, I was faced with a lot of death when I first started in the ICU. And it was one night shift in particular when I was looking after a man who was clearly dying that had a very profound effect on me. And it really upset me, and it made me think, you know, what's death all about? You know, why do we try so hard to prevent people dying when it's futile? We know that they are going to die. And so I started looking for courses that would help me to deal with caring for dying patients in the ICU, but there was nothing available. It was all kind of palliative care, and that has a very different approach to critical care. And I started reading about death, and I picked up every book I could on death, and that's when I came across near-death experiences. And when I started reading them, you know, I thought, wow, these sound really amazing. But I think the kind of scientific, skeptical part of myself kind of held me back a bit. You know, I was a little bit, you know, my nurse training was very scientific, so I'd always been led to believe that these were just hallucinations. But the more I read about them, the more fascinated I became. And I just thought, well, I'm working in the ICU. This is a perfect place to do my own research. And that's how it all started off, really, from that night shift.
And after that, how many patients that you had contact with has had some type of near-death experience?
Well, when I first became interested in them, I started asking a lot of the patients if they had had any kind of experience. And in the beginning, I didn't find that many. But then when I actually did start my research, for the first year, I interviewed everyone who survived their admission to the ICU, regardless of whether or not they'd come close to death. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anyone, you know, and I also wanted to see, was the near-death experience associated with a specific illness? But what I found after the end of that first year, I'd interviewed 243 patients, but only 2 of them had reported an experience. And I found that I was spending longer in the hospital than I was at home. And so I then modified the research after that. So for the next 4 years, I concentrated on people who just had a cardiac arrest. So they were clinically dead for a period of time. And also, of course, in that time, if people spontaneously reported a near-death experience, they were included in the research. Now, the cardiac arrest group was a lot smaller than the first year sample. There were only 39 patients, but out of those 39, 7 of them reported a near-death experience. So that was quite a large frequency, really. That was nearly 18% of cardiac arrest survivors reported this near-death experience.
It'd certainly be great to hear about some of the descriptions of these near-death experiences. Now, the first 7 that you had an opportunity to learn about from these 39 patients, I mean, that's definitely a big jump from 243 to 2. So it went from about 1% to,
Yeah, it was about 18% it was. So
okay,
it was quite a big jump. So it does show that the closer you come to death, the more likely you are to have the experience. But of course, a near-death experience can occur in other circumstances as well. So you could just come close to death. You could have perhaps a near drowning. You could have a road traffic accident. Lots of other different scenarios as well as the cardiac arrest. But it is more prevalent in cardiac arrest.
so out of these 7, were there any similarities?
Yeah, they all kind of tended to follow this set pattern. Now, in 1975, when Dr. Raymond Moody published the book Life After Life, he categorized the near-death experiences as being a set of components. So, for example, it might start off with a person hearing a bystander saying that they've had a cardiac arrest or they've died. They may then have an out-of-body experience where they leave their body and view the emergency situation from above. Sometimes they have a life review. You've heard the expression, my whole life flashed before my eyes. Well,
Right.
sometimes it happens, and it's more than just watching your life, it's actually a reliving of your life as well. And sometimes it's described as in a panoramic review as well. And they can see everything that's going on, it's all around them, but it's all happening at once, but they can understand it as well. And what is really fascinating about the life review is that sometimes they can feel the impact of their actions on other people. So, for example, if they've interacted with people and they've been unpleasant to them or even violent towards someone, they can feel like what it's like to be on the receiving end of that unpleasantness or that violence. And conversely, if they've been nice to someone, they can see the ripple action, the ripple effects of their kindness further down the line in ways that they never even realized. So that has a very profound effect on their life and how they live their life after the experience. Now, some people also go through this dark tunnel towards a very bright light. And although it's a bright light, it doesn't hurt their eyes. And once they get into this light, they could find themselves in beautiful gardens with lush green grass and vividly coloured flowers. They may meet deceased relatives or friends who they didn't even know to be dead at the time of the experience. They may meet religious figures who are usually in accordance with a person's culture. And very often these people they meet send them back. They say, no, it's not your time. You shouldn't be here. You have to go back to life. And sometimes they are sent back to life. And when they come back to life, they feel as if they've got some sort of mission, but they don't know what that mission is. They can't remember why they've come back to life. And very often when they do come back to life, they are profoundly transformed in many, many ways as well. So their life changes, their values, for example. Whereas before the experience, money may have been very important to them and working long hours. All of a sudden, things like that have no importance at all. They become totally lacking in materialism. They actually, the things that they thought they were striving for, they have no interest anymore. And they become more caring and more loving and compassionate towards other people. They're more tolerant of other people. And they genuinely, want to help people. And some people even change their careers. They give up their high-powered jobs and they retrain and become nurses or carers. So it has a very profound effect on them. Also, some very fascinating after effects as well. Some people feel that they gain this kind of healing ability where their hands heat up and they can put their hands on someone who has an ailment, and that can heal or help with the healing of that ailment as well. Some people feel that their electromagnetic field is changed as well. They can't wear wristwatches after the near-death experience. Sometimes, they'll blow a lot of lights when they put the light switch on. Sometimes electrical items such as computers, kettles and toasters will malfunction in their presence, whereas they won't malfunction for anyone else. So there's a whole lot of after effects as well that we sometimes don't realize, and people very often don't associate these after effects as being part of their near-death experience.
Now, there's also those stories of people that have near-death experiences and they have really terrible, frightening encounters with, sometimes they talk about they feel like they're in some type of hell with it being really hot or flamey. And a lot of times I've noticed that's because of their religious backgrounds as well. So I'm wondering if there's some type of psychological conditioning here physically that affects the afterlife experience based upon, I don't know, making it easier for that person to get to the next level.
Yeah, now that's a very good point because not all near-death experiences, quite rightly you've mentioned, not all of them are pleasant. Some of them can be very, very distressing. Now, they've been categorized in three different categories. The first is the usual kind of near-death experience, but it's interpreted in a frightening way. The second type is like a void experience where the person feels that they're in this dark, black, meaningless, eternal void. And the third type is a hellish type where the people feel that they're being dragged down into hell by demons. Now, we don't know why people have these bad experiences, but in the research that's been done, approximately 14% of all near-death experiences can be quite frightening. Now, it's very difficult to gather information on these because a lot of people don't want to share these distressing kinds because there's almost some sort of stigma involved. So it's as if I've had this distressing experience, and is it something about me? Is it something about my moral character? Am I a bad person? And things like that. So it's very difficult to gather those cases. Um, but at the moment, there's no evidence to say that bad people have these experiences or good people have the good experiences. So we really know very little about these. But there are some suggestions that maybe it is due to their religious background and people have had these images ingrained into them through their religion. We really don't know at this stage. We need to do a lot more research into these.
Now, when you've talked to some of these people, have they, I mean, could you see like an extra spark in their eye too? You could just tell that they were so impacted by the event that they truly were like spiritually touched.
Oh yeah, definitely. I've seen so many people, and they are very, very different. It's something about them, as you said, the spark in their eye, and you can see, how and very often it's very difficult for them to put into words exactly what they have experienced because it's beyond anything that they've ever experienced in their life before. But what I will say as well, people who've had the distressing kind of experience, they have a degree of terror in their eyes as well. Now, there's two people I came across in my hospital research. The first case was just the usual prototypical experience, but interpreted in a distressing way. The second type was a hellish type of experience, and the woman was so terrified by the experience, she could only tell me the beginning of it, because as she started to recall what had happened, she really did become stressed. And when I was looking at this lady, I could really see the terror in her eyes. And so I could see the difference between the positive experiences and the distressing experiences as well.
Another thing too, I've talked to people like Graham Nichols and Sandy Gustus, which are really great people, and they know a lot about the out of body experience type phenomenon as well. And it sounds like there's some similarities there. Have you been able to research into the OBEs? And if so, do you think that there's like a connection almost?
No, yes. Now that's interesting because as part of my hospital research, one of the aspects was to see if I could verify the out-of-body experience. And so what I did is I hid very brightly coloured images on top of each patient's bedside monitor. The monitor was mounted off the wall, so it was above head height and it was surrounded by a ridge. So the only way you could see this symbol is if you'd left your body. Now, during the 5 years of my research, 8 people reported the out-of-body component. But what I found is that none of them actually saw the symbol for various different reasons. Now, some of them didn't rise high enough out of their body to view the actual symbol. Some of them floated in directions opposite to where the symbol was situated. So they went into the middle of the room and not to the sides of the room. But the 2 men who had the out-of-body experience that was of the quality where they would have been able to view the symbol, both of those patients said they were so concerned with what was going on with their body, they weren't looking around on top of monitors or anything like that. But one of the men did say to me, if you'd have told me before I'd had the experience, I'd have looked at that monitor and I would have told you what the symbol was. But he didn't know about it, so, he didn't see it. I did have one case that was very, very unique because this man had the experience while I was there looking after him at the time. Now, this is the strongest case of my study. It's been published in 2006 in the Journal of Near-Death Studies with my co-authors, who were the supervisors of my research, Professor Paul Badham and Dr. Peter Fennick. Now, patient 10 was the patient I was looking after on this morning. He didn't have a cardiac arrest, but he was ventilated. He was still quite ill. And this particular morning, we'd sat him in the chair because sitting patients out in the chair as they're beginning to make a recovery is good for their posture and it's good for their breathing as well. And this man we'd sat him in the chair, and I could see that his breathing pattern had changed a bit, and he didn't look comfortable. And his blood pressure began to drop, and then his heart rate went into a very fast rhythm. And I thought at that point, I thought, right, if we don't get this man back into bed, he's going to have a cardiac arrest in the chair. So I called my colleagues, someone phoned the doctor, and we literally flung him back into bed, by which time he was deeply unconscious. Now, the doctor came, we gave him some fluid which resolved the blood pressure problem, but the man was deeply unconscious. He wasn't responding to deep, painful stimuli where we were pressing down on his nail beds with a pen, we were shaking him. There was absolutely no response at all. Shortly afterwards, his condition deteriorated a little bit again. So this time I went out in search of a doctor, and the consultant walked onto the unit for the first time that day. And I quickly called him to come and review the patient, and he then shone a pupil torch in his eyes to check that his pupils were reacting, which they were, but one of them was a little bit more sluggish than the other. Again, we resolved his blood pressure problem, and then the consultant was happy that the patient's condition had improved. The consultant went to his office. Now, the patient then began to sort of flicker his eyelids, and he began to move his limbs. All of these are signs of regaining neurological functioning. About 4 hours later, this man regained full consciousness, and this was as the ward round was approaching his bed. So there were several doctors, physios and nurses present, and he became very excited, and he was trying to communicate something, but he couldn't talk because of the tracheostomy. So the physio got a letterboard, and he spelled, "I died and I watched it all from above." And the doctor said, "Oh, you better tell Penny about that then." And he actually documented this in the patient's notes. And when I interviewed this patient in depth, what he reported was that he had left his body and he was looking down from above, but he said it was as if the ceiling had disappeared, and he was looking from a great height. But he reported everything that I did to clean his mouth. After, when we'd got him into bed, he dribbled from the side of his mouth, and so he described exactly how I cleaned his mouth. He described which doctor had shone the pupil torch in his eyes and examined him, and he hadn't previously seen that doctor in that morning. He also described a physiotherapist looking very nervous and poking her head around the screens, and that was correct, that did happen. But at that point, he was deeply unconscious and his eyes were closed. So, everything he said there was correct, and I know it was correct because I was actually there at the time it happened. Now, further to this, he also described going into like a pink room, and in this pink room, there was his deceased father who was calling him. Another lady who he realised was his deceased mother-in-law. He'd never met her, but he'd seen her in photos. And in the middle of these two people, there was a man, and he said, "I'm not sure who that man was, but he may have been Jesus, but it's not what I expect Jesus to look like, because his hair was long and scruffy and it needed a good combing." But he said his eyes were very piercing, and I was drawn to look at his eyes. But I wanted to stay there, he said. It was so peaceful, all my pain had disappeared, and I just felt so happy. But this Jesus type figure said, "No, you have to go back, it's not your time." And he said as soon as this Jesus figure said that, he could feel himself floating backwards, and that image just faded in front of him. And he said he felt himself back in his body, and as soon as he was in his body, he was in immediate pain, and said he wished he was dead. And an interesting aspect of this case is that this patient has cerebral palsy. So he was 60 years of age at the time of the experience, and his hand had always been in like a claw-like position, a permanently contracted position like this. Now, after his experience, he can now open it out fully like this. Now, there's no physiological explanation for this. And when I asked the doctors or the physiotherapists to explain this, they couldn't explain it. They said that in order for his hand to open out, he would need an operation to release the tendons, but no such operation has been performed. I also checked in his notes to see if he'd had hand physio. Nothing at all was done. So that is something that we really don't understand, but the patient certainly would attribute that to the result of his near-death experience. So, if we had a greater understanding of near-death experiences and how this happened, the mechanism behind it, maybe there are so many other people out there who could benefit from this without having to have an operation.
Well, I've often heard that sometimes ailments and diseases are started from the astral realms, kind of like what some people might consider dream state or something like that because of various reasons. But it's fascinating how you brought that up. He was at such peace and seeing family members, and he gets back and he immediately didn't want to be here. It makes me wonder why we are here. Have there been people that have came back that you've had an opportunity to speak with and said they talked to God or a godlike being that said, the reason you're here or the reason mankind exists is because of X?
Well, people have had encounters with religious beings or sense a presence or what they call a being of light. And some people have said that, they've been in the presence and they get like all the answers to everything. But when they come back to this life, they can't remember those answers. They still are no better off with their knowledge. They just can't remember it. So it's almost as if it's at the tip of their tongue, but they just can't quite recall it. But another interesting aspect of these experiences, I was talking to a lady quite recently, is that many people are quite angry as well at being resuscitated and brought back to life. One lady had a really bad accident where she nearly drowned, and she said, as she was on the beach being revived, she looked up into the eyes of the guy who just revived her, and she was just so angry with him because she was so at peace. She was so at one where she was, and she really wanted to stay there and go on, but she was brought back to life, and so she harbored that anger for quite a few years, she said. So that was and that's not a one-off, that's quite a common thing as well.
Another thing I was wondering about is if you ever looked into some of the past records and previous data, maybe going back 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years into the same near-death experience.
Now, yes, these have been reported throughout history. If you look in the historical literature, there are actually many, many accounts of them. But of course, they're not called near-death experiences then. But if you look into things like a great resource here of medieval experiences, Professor Carol Zaleski wrote a book on otherworld journeys. And this describes all of the medieval literature and the kind of near-death experiences that were reported at that time. And it's fascinating, to think that these have always been with us, but people have never really given them much credence and they've never taken them on board. But I feel that we can learn so much from these experiences. And when I started doing my research, I thought I was going to have all the answers and, I'd know what death was all about. But in fact, I still don't know what happens after we die, but what I've learned has been really beneficial for life. So I think when we start to learn about death, that's when we really start to learn about life.
Has it changed your spiritual beliefs?
Yeah, it has really, because before I got into my research, I was really, black and white. There is no God. There couldn't possibly be a God and things like that. And now it's made me think in ways that I would never have thought of before, So it's opened my mind, and I question everything, but it's taught me to really open my mind and be aware of other aspects as well. So I guess, yeah, it has very much changed my attitude.
And have you ever had like a out of body experience or an NDE?
No, I've never had an experience at all myself. I've spoken to so many people who have, but the thing is though, although I've not had one myself, I feel very much changed in the way that many people who've had the experience are changed. And it's made me live my life in a very different way. And as a result, I feel far more empowered and far more happy with the way my life is as well.
Sure. And certainly to be able to talk to so many people that have had an experience like that, if you were atheist before or didn't believe in a God or just a higher power or divine providence or some type of maker, I could certainly see how it would push you towards that direction. And I think that would feel good. I mean, I've got a friend that's atheist and he thinks when you're dead that's it. There's nothing else. And hey, I mean, maybe that's the way it is, but gosh, that does sound depressing.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's because of our understanding of consciousness, you see. Now, that's one thing that my research has caused me to question. Our current science believes that consciousness is produced by the brain, but there is actually no mechanism as to how that consciousness can arise from the brain. The philosopher Professor David Chalmers has called this the hard problem of consciousness. We don't know how consciousness can arise from a brain. And so as a result of doing my research, what I've come to think is that consciousness is not perhaps I don't think it is produced by the brain. It's more likely to be mediated through the brain, and the brain acts like a kind of filter. So this consciousness or this heightened state of awareness is around us constantly, but we're not aware of it. And there are certain, because the brain screens it out like a filter, and there are times in our life when that filter action of the brain relaxes so that more of this heightened state of awareness is allowed into our everyday reality. So for someone who is approaching death, maybe they're having deathbed visions because that filter action of the brain is relaxing more. someone who has a near-death experience, that filter action again has relaxed greatly. And so it's allowed this heightened state of consciousness into awareness rather than creating anything. And that makes more sense to me. And so, I think it's just a really exciting time to be alive because we're making new discoveries all the time. And I think we're beginning to get a deeper understanding of consciousness.
That's another thing too about consciousness. Maybe every type of item, whether it be a plant or a rock or whatever, just based upon the protons, the neutrons, and the electrons that are oscillating in a certain frequency to create that matter. Maybe everything has some type of consciousness. We're submerged in consciousness, and like you say, our brain and our physical makeup is what allows us to experience consciousness. So
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
that's remarkable. And another thing that I was going to ask is when people go into these states, has anybody ever came back and said, I saw my deceased pet, my old dog or my old, and we were able to communicate telepathically or anything like that?
Yeah, yeah. Some people have, and they often describe seeing their pets come up to them and just feeling very, very comforted by them. Some people can even feel them snuggling in against their leg and things like that. So yes, pets do feature in near-death experiences, and they're quite prevalent in the cases of children as well.
Now, what about reincarnation? Has there ever been any talk of that after coming back from an NDE?
A few people have kind of thought, yes, they that have reported that they feel that they've had past lives as well. I've not looked into that aspect in great detail, but I recently spoke to someone and they'd had a near-death experience, and they also had been seeing been hypnotically regressed, and they also had past lives as well. But I've not done such great deal of research into that aspect of it.
Another old school herb that's been around for thousands of years, DMT, ashwagandha, I think I pronounced that right. And a lot of people say when they've taken that, they've had a near-death-like experience or have gone over to the other side. Have you done any research on that, and are there any comparisons or connections there?
Yeah, there's certainly some connections there, definitely. And they tend to some of the experiences can be quite similar to the near-death experience. There are slight differences as well. But again, when people do take these drugs, the setting and the context is very, very different as well. So when you take these drugs, you're doing it with some form of expectation. So you've read about it, you know a little bit about what to expect. So there's some sort of suggestion before you take the drug. Whereas with the near-death experience, it's a totally different context. It's something that you can't plan to have. You could just step out of your car, go to cross the road and be run over by a bus and have a near-death experience. So the difference is the set and the setting and the context of both of the experiences. But undoubtedly, yes, there are some similarities, but there are also differences as well. But again, with these drugs, are they just acting on the brain and relaxing that filter action? So it's allowing this heightened state of consciousness into the reality of that person.
Also, there's so many different cultures around the world. You've got the natives of every continent. Also, it's really difficult to get some of that old information now because it seems like it's all been assimilated and many people don't have access to it. Have you done research into NDEs with other cultures as well?
Yes, yeah. There's NDEs, they happen in all cultures, and they are very much influenced by the culture as well, the imagery that they see. So, for example, in India, it's a little bit different. People are more likely to see Yama, the god of the dead, or Yamadut, who are the messengers of the god of the dead. And instead of having like a life review in India, they are more likely to meet the man called Chitragupta, the man with the book of deeds, and that has a record of all of the deeds that they've done in their life. So it's a way of kind of judging where they go from that place onwards. So yeah, various different cultures do have various different slants on the experience as well.
Have you done any research into the NDEs with the Nordics and the Vikings, the ancient, like Enki, stuff like that?
No, I haven't. That's one thing I haven't really looked at much, but now you've given me that idea. Maybe that's something I can pursue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A fascinating culture indeed.
Hmm.
Now, another thing also with your book that you put together, I mean, just so much information, precursor to wisdom of near-death experiences. I was wondering if you could walk our listeners through a few parts of that book that maybe we haven't touched on.
Right, okay. So what do I look at now? I can't remember. Um, Let's have a look. I've got it with me behind me. Hang on, let's have a check. Right, okay.
Now, is that available on Amazon? Is it available? What's better, to go through your website?
Yeah, go through Amazon is probably better. It's you get it quicker through Amazon. So there's a lot of different aspects I looked at with these. I looked at the after effects, which we've kind of touched on earlier. Also the cultural aspects, and there's also things like end of life experiences as well, which as a nurse, I saw those very, very frequently. So for example, the first day on the ward when I was a student nurse, I can remember sitting in the office in the morning. The night nurse was handing over, and she said, "Oh, the man in bed, section C, he'll be dead by the end of the morning because he's been talking to his dead mother since about 3 o'clock." And I looked around and thought, are they trying to wind me up because it's my first day? But all of the other nurses carried on writing as if it was the most natural thing to say. And so at the end of the report, I went to this man's bedside, and indeed he was gesturing to someone who I couldn't see. So I was busy with other patients, but throughout the course of the morning, I kept going back and forth to look at this man. And, many times I saw him smiling and gesturing. And then it was about 11:30 in the morning, and I went to his bedside, and he almost like got some energy from somewhere, and he almost sat up in bed, and he had his arms outstretched as if he was going to hug someone. He had this lovely big smile on his face, and then he just kind of put his arms down by his side, lay back down, and looked as if he'd gone to sleep, but he'd actually died. So that was the first encounter I ever had of a deathbed vision. And of course, throughout the rest of my nurse training, my nursing career, I witnessed deathbed visions very, very commonly. And, so very often people would stare as well. There would just be this vacant stare ahead. And even if you clicked your fingers in front of their eyes, they would not look at you. They would just completely stare. And afterwards, they said that they'd been in the presence of their loved ones. And so it's a very common phenomenon. And I know that when my grandfather was dying, and this was before I got into my research, I was a student nurse, and I can remember as he was dying at home, he used to point to the doorway and he'd say, "Look who's standing there, look who's there." Now, my grandmother was really spooked by this, and she used to run out of the room, but I didn't pay any attention because I wasn't interested in these things. And he always used to point to the door and say, "Look who's there." And it didn't frighten him at all, he was very comforted by it. And so I've witnessed it firsthand in my family as well as the patients I've looked after. So those are the deathbed visions. There's also things like after death communications. And many, many people have written to me and emailed me about their experiences after their loved ones have died. What they've found is that they get very subtle messages or subtle signs. Sometimes they can smell the perfume of their loved one. They can smell flowers associated with them. Some people actually feel them. They can feel their arms around them. Some people have seen their loved ones as well. So there's a lot of different things. And sometimes the after-death communication can be as simple as being symbolic. So it could be like seeing a butterfly out of season, or seeing a rainbow in an unusual place that has significance to the loved one. So that is a very interesting aspect as well. And there has been lots and lots written on after-death communications. But if you read all the books that are out there, all of the authors have said how beneficial these experiences are because they greatly aid with the grieving process. So if you think how many people out there are grieving the loss of a loved one, these books really provide great comfort for them as well. And something else I came across as well was the empathic or shared death experience. And this is fascinating because people who are even separated at great distances from their loved ones can sometimes adopt the symptoms that they are having. They can manifest the symptoms of their dying loved one, even though they're separated by miles. So, for example, there's one lady who many years ago now, she emailed me because she was looking for answers when her mother was dying. Her name is Annie Cap, and she's written a book about her experience, and it's called Beyond Goodbye. And she described, Annie is a therapist and she lives in the UK, but her mother was in Oregon and she was dying in the hospital, but she didn't realize her mother was dying. Now, this afternoon, Annie was treating a client, and it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and Annie suddenly became overcome with a feeling in her throat that there was something there, and she began coughing, and she just couldn't stop coughing, and she just couldn't clear her throat. And in the end, she had to terminate the session that she had with her client, and she intuitively then thought, right, I've got to phone my mother. So she phoned her mum, She got through to the hospital, she got through to her room, and Annie's sister answered the phone and she said, "I'm glad that you phoned because Mum has taken a turn for the worst." And in the background, she could hear her mother, and she was coughing and gurgling, and her lungs had filled up with fluid. And so Annie's symptoms instantly disappeared, but she was able to speak with her. Her mother couldn't speak to her, but she was able to speak over the phone and say her goodbyes to her mum. And that was something that had a very profound effect on her. And also as well, people who are at the bedside of dying patients, they too can sometimes share in a partial journey into the light with their loved ones as well. And very often, that can really help with the grieving process as well. Another thing that I write about in my book, when I was a nurse, I observed many times people, even though they were dying or they were unconscious at the time, they still seemed to have control over the time when they died. So, for example, many times I witnessed patients who we thought were going to die immediately. They hang on for days and sometimes a couple of weeks until a member of family had arrived from abroad. Some people as well, I observed, they hang on for a specific event, something like a wedding or a christening, and once that event had passed, they died quite suddenly after that. And another thing that I witnessed as well is that many patients, like in the ICU, the visitors could be there for long periods of time, for most of the day. And in many times I encountered times when I'd said to the family, "Look, I need to do some nursing care. Why don't you go and have a break down the canteen?" And once the family had left the bedside, very often I came across patients who very rapidly deteriorated, and I had to run down to the canteen to get the family back. And by the time we arrived back, the patient had died. And very often, the family were devastated that they hadn't been there with their loved one. But what I came to realize or think is that perhaps when they left, they actually made it easier for their loved one to make that transition into death. And I think it's almost like the love of the family, which was keeping them in this world, if you like. And so, although them being there actually made it easier for them to make that transition. So there were things like that I observed throughout my nursing career, which really have fascinated me as well. Other things that I go through in the book as well. I go through the actual research study I did, and how we've medicalized death. We've gone from death used to be at home. It was a big social event. Many people would be dying, and the neighbours would be in, and young children would be sitting on the bed of that dying person. And now all of a sudden our medical system has changed greatly, and death is now pushed to one side, and it's like, it's in the clinical place of the hospital, and often people die in a very unfriendly clinical white room on their own, and so people don't get to see and observe the things that go on around death as well. So, death is such a taboo subject now, and we're not exposed to it anymore in the ways that we were years ago.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point. It seems like now everything is commercialized, whether you're, Western culture, Eastern culture, it's this corporatocracy at the top levels that seems to control every aspect, whether it's healthcare, the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, everything. And now it's, like you said, even at somebody's death, instead of being in their home with their loved ones and being around what they are used to, they're in this room with no personality around a bunch of other people that are sick or dying. And it's just this, blah, grayscale, no passion, no energy. And I think you bring up a good point. Wouldn't it be fascinating if there was something set up for when people were going to pass and transition to the other side? Maybe they could have a really cool environment and nice atmosphere. I mean, that would make a huge difference, I think, for everybody involved.
Absolutely, yes. And now what we're seeing as well is it's a growing movement called soul midwifery or death doulas in the USA. But in the UK, we've got a lady called Felicity Warner, and she would be great for you for the LEAK project, because her work is so important. And what she does is provide that service, and she trains soul midwives to be the companion of someone as they're dying, so that they could be there, and they write death plans. And so death is, all of a sudden, it's not that horrible thing that we're afraid of. It's a natural part of life. And so they have these soul midwives, and it's such an important thing. And I think we're going to see more and more of soul midwives in the future.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Also, you're working on quite a bit right now. You've got multiple things that you're doing, but you're putting together another book, aren't you?
I am, yes. Now I've got a short book coming out. I've got a copy here, This is called What is a Near-Death Experience? And this is just a precursor to the wisdom of near-death experiences. So this is like a beginner's guide for people who are not familiar with near-death experiences, and it's part of the Watkins Mind, Body, Spirit series. I'm also working on a collaborative book as well with another few authors, and that's going to be a mixture of lots of different near-death experiences and also how people have been changed by the experience. And I've had some fascinating cases here, and there's some really great cases that are going to be a part of this book. And it's all about the message of unconditional love. You know, it's focusing on the message of the near-death experience and how that can change the world. And I'm hoping it's going to have a big impact on people, you know.
Absolutely. Now, just a couple other questions before we close out tonight. I know it's getting late where it's later where you're at. Have you ever been able to speak with somebody that went so far into the other side that, I mean, how far have you been able to, how far has somebody gone out there that you were able to learn about?
Well, in the beginning of the book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, I described the experience of Jules Lyons, and this is a really quite extensive near-death experience. Now, this lady was only unconscious for seconds, yet what she describes would take about 4 days in earthly life to kind of experience, and it's very extensive, you know. And so it's all kind of you it's hard to put, you know, because you get some experiences where people are flatlined for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then you get some people who are flatlined for just maybe 30 seconds, and then you get different experiences as well. So the kind of depth of the experience is not really related to the amount of time that they were unconscious for. So with Jules, you know, she had such an extensive experience that it went on, and you know, she didn't really want to come back either. So it's difficult to answer that question really for those reasons.
Sure. And another thing too that I'm thinking about is I read a book called The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot. And
Oh,
have you
great
read
book.
that? Yeah.
Yeah.
And amazing. And it's too bad that he passed away shortly after, like 2 years after coming out with that book, which was very weird in my mind. I mean, it's like, okay, either that was his magnum opus and that was meant to be, he was, meant to go somewhere else and do something else that's great, or maybe something, I mean, you get into a little conspiracy here, but because, you read the book and he talks about how the placebo effect is so powerful and pharmaceutical companies have so much power over the human race, and people were healing themselves just as good with placebos almost as than with the pharmaceutical drugs. And he talked about some cancer cases where people were able to, they thought they were on medication that worked because their mind, because they read something in an article, so they were just convinced that it worked, and it did, and they were fine. And then they read an article that said it was a placebo, and they died shortly later. And then he dies 2 years later of cancer. I mean, it's very odd.
Yeah, that's right. And it was a great book. And, you know, it highlights how powerful our minds are and how we don't understand our minds. You know, there's so much more that we need to understand. And I think we're making new discoveries about our mind all the time. And I think near-death experiences have certainly given me a direction to look for understanding the mind as well.
Have you ever heard that the possibility of the light itself is actually a hoax, and if you go to the light, it's like resetting. It's like hitting the reset button, kind of like when you see those bugs that fly to the light, and all of a sudden, zzz.
Uh-huh. I don't know. I've not heard of that, to be honest with you. That's an interesting concept, but I don't know. When people are in that light, they get to the light and they're overwhelmed by it, and all they feel is this deep unconditional love, and they feel enveloped in love, as if almost as if they're being blanketed in love, and they just describe it as a wonderful experience. But despite the brightness of the light, it doesn't hurt their eyes, and they're very comfortable there. So,
It seems like there's this polarity in so many different aspects. You've got the light, the dark, and in order to see the light, you have to have the dark. And, I mean, to understand the difference of shades there. So it's just certainly remarkable. And you certainly brought a sense of, I guess you could say, hope to me even, is the fact that when we do go on to the next side, hopefully it'll be something that it'll be amazing for us and an opportunity to see our relatives that passed away several years ago and feel quality of life that many people don't have the opportunity to experience here. So, you certainly brought a sense of just amazing opportunities to the table here at the Leap Project. And I appreciate that. We get into a lot of times doom and gloom on here, and it certainly is nice to get into a refreshing approach of what the possibilities are after this physical essence.
oh, great, great. And I really do hope it helps a lot of people, because some people have such a fear of death, And I think, you know, when I started to learn about near-death experiences, it took that fear of death away for me, and I hope it can do the same for other people as well.
Absolutely. So, I got to tell you, Penny, this has been great. I appreciate you coming on the show with us here at the Leak Project. Those that have an opportunity to listen to this broadcast, go to drpennysartori.com. That's spelled Dr. Penny, PennySartori.com. Just a ton of information there. Also, your books are available on Amazon, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, and that precursor that's going to come out for somebody that might want to jump into just a smaller step, a smaller version first before they get into the big screen there. So thanks, Penny. This has been an absolute pleasure. I appreciate it.
Welcome. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you have a wonderful night.
You too.
Hey everybody, this is Rex Bear with Leak Project, and tonight we're going to be discussing the NDE phenomenon, near-death experiences, with Dr. Penny Sartori. Penny is an expert in near-death experiences and worked as a nurse in a British hospital for 21 years, 17 of those being in intensive care. She is highly experienced and skilled in her role as an intensive care staff nurse and has conducted unique and extensive research into the near-death experiences of her patients. In 2005, she was awarded a PhD for her research into NDEs, and Dr. Sartori's work has received worldwide attention as well as media coverage. She has spoken at many conferences, both nationally and internationally, and her work has received the attention of HRH Prince Charles. So if you'd like to know more about Penny and the near-death experience phenomenon, check out drpennysartori.com. That's Dr. Penny with a Y, Sartori.com. Her book is available on Amazon. It's called The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences. It's a treasure trove of information as well as firsthand experiences of people that have had some amazing NDEs and what they brought back with them. So this is going to be an awesome hour of information. We communicated a little bit previously, and I had the opportunity to get into your book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, and wow, I mean, it is absolutely incredible. You've got a great website, drpennysartori.com, a lot of information on there from the near-death experience phenomenon, and it's just really great to have you on the show. I was hoping if you would, for our listeners, describe a little bit about yourself, and then I'd like to jump into why you got into the NDEs.
Okay, well, I used to work as a nurse, as you've just said, and then I kind of thought I could do more really from outside, being outside, because I wanted to change things within nursing, and I decided to leave nursing and teach about near-death experiences, and I spent some time writing that book. And now I work at the university in Swansea, and I do teach 2 modules. One of them is called Exploring the Mind and Consciousness, and the other one is called Science, Spirituality and Health. And I teach that on a part-time humanities degree. The reason I got into near-death experiences is just through my job. You know, I began working in the ICU, and I realised that people of all ages die. It's not just elderly people. You know, I was faced with a lot of death when I first started in the ICU, and it was one night shift in particular when I was looking after a man who was clearly dying that had a very profound effect on me, and it really upset me, and it made me think, you know, what's death all about? You know, why do we try so hard to prevent people dying when it's futile? We know that they are going to die. And so I started looking for courses that would help me to deal with caring for dying patients in the ICU, but there was nothing available. It was all kind of palliative care, and that has a very different approach to critical care. And I started reading about death, and I picked up every book I could on death, and that's when I came across near-death experiences. And when I started reading them, you know, I thought, wow, these sound really amazing. But I think the kind of scientific, skeptical part of myself kind of held me back a bit. You know, I was a little bit, you know, my nurse training was very scientific. So I'd always been led to believe that these were just hallucinations. But the more I read about them, the more fascinated I became. And I just thought, well, I'm working in the ICU. This is a perfect place to do my own research. And that's how it all started off, really, from that night shift.
And after that, how many patients that you had contact with has had some type of near-death experience?
Well, when I first became interested in them, I started asking a lot of the patients if they had had any kind of experience. And in the beginning, I didn't find that many. But then when I actually did start my research, for the first year, I interviewed everyone who survived their admission to the ICU, regardless of whether or not they'd come close to death. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anyone, you know. And I also wanted to see, was the near-death experience associated with a specific illness? But what I found after the end of that first year, I'd interviewed 243 patients, but only two of them had reported an experience. And I found that I was spending longer in the hospital than I was at home. And so I then modified the research after that. So for the next 4 years, I concentrated on people who just had a cardiac arrest. So they were clinically dead for a period of time. And also, of course, in that time, if people spontaneously reported a near-death experience, they were included in the research. Now, the cardiac arrest group was a lot smaller than the first year sample. There were only 39 patients, but out of those 39, 7 of them reported a near-death experience. So that was quite a large frequency, really. That was nearly 18% of cardiac arrest survivors reported this near-death experience.
It'd certainly be great to hear about some of the descriptions of these near-death experiences. Now, the first 7 that you had an opportunity to learn about from these 39 patients, I mean, that's definitely a big jump from 243 to 2. So it went from about 1% to,
Yeah, it was about 18% it was. So
okay,
it was quite a big jump. So it does show that the closer you come to death, the more likely you are to have the experience. But of course, a near-death experience can occur in other circumstances as well. So you could just come close to death. You could have perhaps a near drowning. You could have a road traffic accident. Lots of other different scenarios as well as a cardiac arrest. But it is more prevalent in cardiac arrest.
so out of these 7, were there any similarities?
Yeah, they all kind of tended to follow this set pattern. Now, in 1975, when Dr. Raymond Moody published the book Life After Life, he categorized the near-death experiences as being a set of components. So, for example, it might start off with a person hearing a bystander saying that they've had a cardiac arrest or they've died. They may then have an out-of-body experience where they leave their body and view the emergency situation from above. Sometimes they have a life review. You've heard the expression, my whole life flashed before my eyes. Well,
Right.
sometimes it happens. And it's more than just watching your life, it's actually a reliving of your life as well. And sometimes it's described as in a panoramic review as well. And they can see everything that's going on, it's all around them,